Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 10 for History 101. And today we're going to pick back up with the Philadelphia Convention that's called to order in Philadelphia in 1787. Now, this convention is going to be held at Independence Hall in Philly. And obviously, Hamilton and Madison arrive early, getting prepared for what they hope will be a successful convention this time. Granted, they're both kind of nervous Nellies, wondering if the networking worked. They were relieved when George Washington arrived from Virginia, the center attraction to draw people in. And when they call the convention to order in May of 1787, 55 delegates show up representing 12 states. So, a far cry from the 12 delegates representing 5 states the previous year in Annapolis. So their homework had paid off. The only state that did not send a delegation to Philadelphia in 1787 was Rhode Island. But the consensus among other delegates was good. Rhode Island was known for being obstinate and sort of argumentative, I should say. And a lot of people concluded this will be a much smoother convention without Rhode Island here, because all they'll do is pick apart everything we talk about. We'll get them to agree to what we come up with after the fact. So, the 55 delegates that show up in Philadelphia in May of 1787 are commonly known as the Founding Fathers. So let me tell you a little bit about these gentlemen. And the first thing I would mention, they're all men. No women attended the Constitutional, or I should say the Philadelphia Convention, which becomes obviously the Constitutional Convention, because it would not have been acceptable in 1787. First of all, women didn't vote and weren't going to vote for quite some time. And politics was sort of seen as dirty work that only men were involved in. It was beneath women to be engaged in such dirty things as politics. And, gender differences were greatly exaggerated back then. It was a completely different world. So even if a woman wanted to attend it, it would have been completely unacceptable. But there were some women behind the scenes who had influence on this convention, one being Martha Washington that George corresponded with throughout the convention, and another one being Abigail Adams. John Adams was a delegate representing Massachusetts. Abigail Adams was very politically astute. And in fact, Harvard has a collection of the letters written back and forth between John and Abigail, who was back in Boston throughout the entire summer of 1787, where John Adams was constantly seeking Abigail's advice on controversial issues occurring at the convention. So all told, really, there were founding mothers who were acting behind the scenes in this convention. None of them were present, though. So let me tell you a little bit about these 55 men who showed up in Philly. First of all, there's a great deal of political experience among the Founding Fathers. 44 of them had served in the Continental Congress either during the Revolution or during the Articles of Confederation. So they had served in the federal government and knew how problem-filled it was. 40 of the 55 had served in high state offices. So they knew the state to federal relationship. And some of the delegates were governors at the time, like Governor Randolph from Virginia and Patterson from New Jersey. 8 of the Founding Fathers were what I suppose we would call original patriots. They had signed the Declaration of Independence. including the oldest senior delegate at the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin, who attended the convention in his hometown representing Pennsylvania, and he was sort of the grandfather of the convention. He's a walking American history book. He was at every great meeting that had happened previously, so he was like a living reference for them to turn to. Half of the founding fathers had graduated from college, which was unheard of back in this day and age. For one thing, there weren't many colleges to begin with in our country at this point in history. And also, your parents had to be wealthy enough to pay to send you not only through K through 12, because there was no such thing as public schools, but then on top of it, send you off to college. So this was a very elite group, having half of them college grads. 33 of the 55 were attorneys. Now, you might say, how come there's more attorneys than college grads? That's because you didn't have to go to college to be an attorney back in this period of American history. You could serve an apprenticeship and work under practicing attorneys for a time period, then take your respective bar exam, and then you would be an attorney. So 33 attorneys were in the room. There was a great deal of military experience in the room. 27 of the 55 men had been officers during the American Revolution, including George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. And finally, the institution of slavery was represented. 15 of the 55 were slaveholders. And that's going to become an issue as the convention materializes. So, we've got the number we need in Philadelphia. Now it's time to proceed with what happens there. Now, they're going to start out by presenting a plan to base everything on and, start this new government that I'll talk about in a minute. But right off the bat, they have to get through some formalities. The first thing that they're going to do right off the bat is they're going to elect George Washington to preside over the entire affair. So he's chairman or whatever you want to call him. That's why when you see the famous paintings of the Constitutional Convention, he's always seated up on the stage, sometimes behind a desk, running the show. Only makes sense. He's the guy, the most famous American, make him the leadership of this convention. So the second thing that they do is they agree to keep everything that goes on inside Independence Hall a secret until the convention adjourns, which they have no idea when that'll be, and it will not be until September, as it turns out. Now, the reason why they do this is because when they look around the room, about 75% of the people who are in attendance are Federalists. Only about 25% come from the opposition faction, which is commonly known as the Anti-Federalists, or sometimes you'll see them referred to in the writings as the states' rights men. That's the way they want to keep it. If they start having daily press conferences, Anti-Federalists will converge on Philadelphia, some of which who might have begged off the convention, to try to gum it up and block any transfer of power from the states to the federal governments, which they were in opposition to. So, once everything's going to be a secret, and let me give you a couple examples of how dedicated they are to this. How long do you think it would take something to leak out of a convention like this today if we had one? 5 minutes at the most until somebody snuck into the bathroom and tweeted what was going on inside Independence Hall. Well, we live in a different age, obviously, technology-wise, but we also live in a different age as far as politics. These 55 men were men of honor. And if they agreed to keep this a secret, by God, they're keeping it a secret because their honor rested upon it and it meant something back then, unlike today. So here's what happens in July. They catch a couple reporters outside an open window at Independence Hall trying to eavesdrop on what's going on inside because they've been in there for nearly 2 months and not a peep out of what's happening. So these guys are shooed off the property, and then for the next week, they close up all the windows and doors in Independence Hall to make sure nobody comes and tries to do it again. Now let's think about that for a second. It's Independence Hall in late July 1787. There's no such thing as air conditioning. There's no such thing as an electric fan. All these guys are dressed in suits, and you can imagine how hot and horrible it was in there. Not to mention, as we know when we talked about Benjamin Franklin, he was probably the only guy who bathed regularly because he probably took a swim after every meeting. So it had to have been pretty gamey inside Independence Hall during that week, but they did this. That's how dedicated they were. So once they know it's all going to be a secret, then they can get to work, and a motion is made on the floor to not bother to talk about how to alter the Articles of Confederation, which the Philadelphia Convention was billed as, but they'd be farther ahead to take the Articles of Confederation, crumble them up, throw them in the trash can, and start over. You can't fix this severely broken system. And it's not an outrageous idea. Nobody was in love with the Articles of Confederation. They'd only existed since 1781. Unlike today, if somebody suggested we take the Constitution, crumble it up, and throw it in the trash and start over, people would have a fit because of the historic legacy of that document. So, they agree, let's just start over. So, the first plan to reform the whole system's offered up on the floor of the convention, and that plan is the Virginia Plan. It's really the work of James Madison. This is his rough draft that he'd showed to Washington, and it had been more refined by the time this happens, and it's sort of a full-fledged plan on how the government will work. It's introduced by the head of the Virginia delegation, Governor Edmund Randolph. He gets to introduce it because he's the boss. So he presents the Virginia Plan in a nutshell. It involves, as most of all you know, 3 branches of government: an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch. But there's a couple glaring differences from the system we have today. It is entirely based on popular representation in both the House and the Senate, meaning you send the number of members to the House and the Senate based on the population of your state. So large states would have big delegations. Small states, population-wise, would have very small. Like today, for example. New York State has 25 members in the House of Representatives due to our population. Vermont has 1, the minimum number, because they're 49th out of 50 in state populations. So both houses would be based that way. And another difference is the president wouldn't be elected by popular vote. He would be selected by the legislature, sort of in a parliamentary fashion, like they pick a prime minister in England. So, this is the plan put forth. It's debated, and it's pretty quickly voted down because medium to small states quickly realize a handful of large states could dominate the entire system. Because if Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New York formed a coalition, those 4 states would have a majority due to their high populations compared to the other states. And these other states wanted no part of that. So, the next plan is offered up on the floor of the convention, and everybody kind of anticipates where this is going to come from. It's going to come from the state of New Jersey and their governor, Governor Patterson. And the reason why they know he'll come up with the next plan is he and Governor Randolph of Virginia do not like each other. They've been at many different meetings in attendance together, and all they do is argue, and everybody knew this. So, of course, if Randolph had his day in the sun with the Virginia plan, Patterson's going to have his day in the sun with the New Jersey plan. So his plan is basically a modified version of Madison's Virginia plan, except it's going to base representation in both the House and the Senate on equal representation. So each state would send an equal number of representatives to both the House and the Senate. Now, most of you know that's how the Senate works today. New York State has 2 New York senators, Gillibrand and Schumer, and Vermont has 2 U.S. senators, Leahy and Sanders. Equal representation, no matter what the population is. Also, it called for the president to be elected by the people and the judiciary to be a joint selection process between the president and the Senate. So, this plan's put up for a vote, and very quickly, Governor Randolph of Virginia gets up and rips it apart in a debate. And he says, basically, obviously, his esteemed colleague from New Jersey completely forgot why we fought the Revolutionary War. This is a plan that is nothing more than taxation without representation. When you equally represent all the states, some states have numerous more taxpayers, like his state of Virginia compared to New Jersey, but they'll be equally represented. That's taxation without proper representation. So, with that said, and the Revolutionary War is still fresh in the minds of everybody, they vote this plan down because they know if they come out with a new government that's labeled taxation without representation, they're wasting their time. So, the convention reaches a standstill. Nothing's happened. They've been arguing for well over a week, and basically all it is Randolph and Patterson arguing again as usual. So, some delegates start coming up to Hamilton and Madison, congratulating them for the convention they arranged, but give them some disheartening news that some of their delegation is ready to pack it up and go home because nothing's happened since the first day. And they're sick and tired of hearing these endless arguments, so something better happen fast or the convention's going to start falling apart. So, Hamilton and Madison go to Benjamin Franklin, and the 3 of them sit down and work out a viable compromise. The problem is the 3 of them don't have a delegation to introduce it. The Virginia delegation, led by Randolph, is not going to introduce a compromise. He's standing pat with the Virginia plan, and it would make him appear to be weak to Patterson. Pennsylvania is one of the large states. They've allied themselves with the Virginia plan, as well as Hamilton's delegation, New York. So Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin have some close friends who are there in the Connecticut delegation. They take their compromise plan to them and ask them, could you please introduce this for us? It's a viable compromise, and it makes sense for a medium-sized state such as yourselves to introduce it. So the Connecticut delegation agrees to introduce this plan. So the plan originally was known as the Connecticut Plan, even though Hamilton, Madison, and Franklin rewrote the Virginia Plan and modified it. So they introduced it, and basically it's the best of both worlds, and it really didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out this compromise. The House of Representatives will be based on popular representation, just like today, with New York having 25, Vermont 1. The Senate, which has more important decisions like ratifications of treaties, confirmation of Supreme Court justices and so forth, will have equal representation, just like today with New York having 2 senators and Vermont having 2. And the rest of the best parts of the New Jersey plan are preserved. It's introduced and it sails through and is approved. This is a big breakthrough for the convention. Now people won't start leaving. They have a basic framework to work off of. Today, we call that plan, the Connecticut Plan, the Great Compromise. But in reality, it's the Connecticut Plan. That's also why Connecticut still has on their license plates that they're the Constitution state. They're the ones who introduced the saving plan. Now, that evening, it's time for celebration. They had a breakthrough. So they go, all the founding fathers walk a few blocks down the street to the Indian Queen Tavern to have a celebration dinner. Now, at this celebration dinner, the next issue is already going to arise. All the delegates are sitting at different tables, they're eating and drinking. And remember, these guys are all politicians, you know their backgrounds. Some of them are already talking about where they envision themselves in this brand new government. Some of them say, well, I think I'll probably run for the House of Representatives from my state. Others might be saying, boy, I hope the state legislature appoints me to be a senator, because originally that's how senators were selected, not voted in by the people. And everybody's kind of saying, we all know who's going to be the first president, don't we? If he wants to be, obviously George Washington. But here's where the problem arises. When they're talking about how many members of the House of Representatives the respective states will send, the numbers don't add up. Because some states, especially in the South, are counting slaves as part of their population. Other states, especially in the North, are not counting slaves as part of the state population to determine how many members of the House you send to Washington. Well, Washington in the future doesn't exist at this point. That's where the next big debate comes from. Whether or not or how are we going to count slaves in this process of determining populations of each state for representation purposes? So that's where we'll pick up next class. We'll talk about how that ultimately turns into the 3/5 compromise. We'll talk about voter qualification in the Constitution. And then we'll talk about the ratification process and the institution of the brand new government and the election of President Washington. So that's all for today. I hope everybody's safe and healthy. New York pause has been extended for 2 more weeks by the governor. So please abide by the rules and stay home as much as possible. It's working up here in the North Country, and we want to keep it that way. So everybody be safe. I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye now.